my fellow geeks. Today I'm going to talk about comic books and a bunch of different things I wish I had known when I first started collecting. We're going to talk about the types of collectors, cataloging your collection, storing, displaying, and buying comic books. Stick around until the end of the video and I will share with you a couple flip books that my fiance and I made for one another for Valentine's Day. Let's start by discussing the types of collectors. That way you can identify what type of collector you are or want to be. You basically have three types of collectors: the investor, the reader, and the fanatic. Investors are primarily focused on the dollar value of their comic books. They treat their collection like the stock market, looking to buy and sell at the right time to try to make some money. A good example of a situation they would look out for would be the newer Thor movies, when there were rumors that Beta Ray Bill or Angela might be making an appearance. Well, important issues and first appearances of those characters, those comic books really saw a boom in the market and were being bought and sold by investors to try to make some money. The second type of collector is a reader. Readers are mainly concerned with the enjoyment they get from actually reading comic books. They're not interested in the prices. Readers don't focus on a particular character or run or brand. They will buy anything that catches their attention. So new issues, back issues, comic books they've never heard of, because they care mostly about good storylines and good illustrations. The third type of collector is the fanatic. A fanatic is someone who's going to go after basically anything and everything that has to do with their particular fandom or characters that they love. So if you're a fanatic of, let's say, Spider-Man, you're going to go after complete runs of certain storylines. You're going to go after back issues, new issues, anything that you're missing. You're going to go after first appearances of certain characters, deaths of certain characters. Like I said, anything and everything that has to do with your particular fandom. All right, let's talk about cataloging your collection. When I first started collecting comic books, I was using an Excel spreadsheet, and I very quickly realized that this was a super inefficient way to keep track of my comic books. I would have to physically update it. It would take a long time. I would have to carry around a printed off piece of paper with me, and it wasn't gonna work moving forward. So now I recommend everyone download the app CLZ Comics. This is a free application for your iPhone or Android, and you can even access your collection on a desktop computer with your username and password. They store your collection online, so if you ever get a new phone, you don't have to copy any data over to that new phone, and you've always got your collection at your fingertips, in your pocket, whenever you're somewhere like a garage sale or a comic convention. CLZ Comics is super easy to use. You just search up the name and issue of the comic book and hit add to my collection. It's that easy. I've only ever had one instance of not being able to find a particular comic book, and in that case, I just took a picture of my comic book, wrote a little description, and hit add to my collection. I even think when that happens, that comic book would be uploaded and added to their database. That way other collectors can find it and add to their collection. When it comes to storing your comic book collection, there's really only one way to go about it, and that is the bag, board, and box method. If there's a better way, I haven't heard about it. First, you're gonna wanna get your hands on some polyester bags. This is what your comic book and board are gonna slide into to protect your comic book from dust or maybe a little bit of moisture. Just be careful, there are different size comic books, so different size bags. Any good comic book shop is gonna point you in the right direction. Next, you're gonna wanna pick up some board, and you're gonna find this right next to the bags that you just purchased. Just make sure they're the right size. This is just simple cardstock that you're gonna slide into the bag with your comic book, and it's gonna stop your comic book from bending or creasing or folding. Typically, this stuff is coated on one side and uncoated on the other. I'm not entirely sure which side should go up against your comic book, so if you can help me out, let me know in the comments. Once you've got your bags and your boards, you're gonna wanna pick up some boxes. And these are just simple cardboard boxes that perfectly fit comic books. Again, any comic book shop, you're gonna find these. These are known as short boxes, and I fit about 150 comic books in each box. Now, that does depend a little bit on how tightly you like to pack them and the thickness of your comic books. There's also long boxes, which are about 50% longer than these short boxes. Just be careful, these will not protect against water damage, so particularly in basements, maybe store them up high. On the topic of storage, I've got 3 valuable tips for you. Tip number 1 seems pretty simple, but I have ruined a few of my covers this way, so just passing down the information. On the back of your bag, most people use a piece of tape to keep the flap down and keep it closed. So that means that you need to be super careful when you're pulling your comic book out, because it will have a tendency to flap open and the tape will get stuck on the top of the paper there on the cover as you're pulling it out and rip. That's no good. Tip number 2, if you have a larger collection, it can be really frustrating or difficult to find the exact comic book you're looking for. So I recommend making some tabs for all of your boxes. That way you can find just what you're looking for. Myself, just some scrap pieces of cardstock with a label on the top. You can see this one is Shirtless Bear Fighter. You can then even label the box. So maybe the box is just Marvel or DC, or in my case, Spawn. Even though you're using a board inside your bag with your comic book, they're not indestructible. They can still bend. So, tip number 3, I recommend using something like a towel inside your box to put on one side and stop your comic books from falling on top of one another. I do this in all of my boxes. Always make sure to bag, board, and box your comic books. This is a cheap and effective way of protecting your collection. But if you're anything like me, you hate the idea of having your comic books tucked away in a corner, hidden and collecting dust. So let's move on to displaying your comic books. This is where you have so many more options available to you. I've seen simple things like just pinning your comic book to the wall, obviously through the bag and board, not the actual comic book. You could buy a classic comic book display stand. That's gonna run you a couple $100 though, likely. You could frame your comic book and have it as a centerpiece on the wall. You could use those little stands that people display plates on. Or you could get creative and make something entirely your own. These comic book display stands behind me here are actually homemade, so let's talk a bit more about those to give you a better idea of what you can create. These are cheap, easy to make, lightweight display stands made from balsa wood, wood glue, and some spray varnish. You can find all those materials at your local craft store or hobby store. Each display holds 3 comic books, and I banged out 8 display stands in just a couple hours. I do wish they were a little bit taller so that front piece of wood was at least halfway up the comic book, and I wish they were a little bit wider because the comic books right now are overlapping just a little bit. That being said, I think they serve their purpose perfectly. Finally, let's discuss actually buying comic books, and in particular, where you're buying your comic books. This is where the type of collector you are is going to influence you and push you in one direction or the other. If you're an investor, it doesn't really matter where you're buying or selling your comic books because you're just looking for the best possible price. If you're a fanatic or a reader, the one place I recommend you do not buy your comic books is online, and that's for 2 different reasons. 1, you can't inspect your comic book. You can't flip through it and you can't look for damage. But more importantly, as a collector, I'm gonna bet that you enjoy the act of collecting more than owning the comic books. So you enjoy the thrill of the hunt. And when you buy online, it's completely void of that spark. You just type in the name of the comic you want and hit buy. How boring is that? So real quick, I'm gonna recommend all the following places. Thrift stores. Bad selection, you're really gonna have to hunt, but good prices. Just be careful because they like to put the stickers right on the comic book. Yard sales, even worse selection than thrift stores, but the possibility of finding that one smoking deal is worth it. Antique shops, good selection, but also high prices because typically they know the value of their comic books. Flea markets, these are my favorite. You have the best of both worlds, good selection and good prices. and your comic expos / conventions. This is going to give you the best selection and chance of finding what you're looking for, but they are going to have a little bit higher prices. However, they are usually willing to haggle. And last, we have the comic book shop. If you are a reader, you're going to be buying a lot of comic books here. Most comic book shops specialize in new issues with a small selection of back issues. If you find a series you enjoy, I recommend getting a pull file or subscription box with that comic book shop. It's a great way to support local and make sure you never miss an issue. I have a pull file with a local shop for Spawn, so every time a new issue comes out, he puts one aside, puts it into my pull file, and then when I visit the store, I can pay and pick up for everything in my pull file. I hope you found something useful from these tips, and I wish you well in your comic book collecting journey. Now, as promised, I'm gonna leave you with some homemade flipbook animation. Thanks for watching.